Another reason why a lot of people choose not to homeschool is because of the critics in their life, whether it's maybe their parents or a neighbor or a friend, someone who truly cares about them, but really doesn't understand the benefits and the blessing of homeschooling. How do you answer the critics?
Well, it's a great question, right? Because we all have critics in our life. And when my husband and I made the decision to homeschool, we were the first in our family to do it. And I think a lot of people listening to that can relate to that. A lot of us are first generation homeschoolers. Never thought we would do this thing, never wanted to do it. And so we make what is considered to be a radical decision, right? And of course, people are going to look at that and go, why would you do that? And I always like to tell parents, first of all, fruit takes time to grow. I live in Washington State, and we are very proud of the fact that we grow apples here. So golden delicious apples, Gala apples. We grow all these apples. No one would ever go up to a man who is planting his orchard and a year and a half into it, when his saplings are just taking root and maybe he's got 1.5 foot sapling poking out of the ground. They're never going to go up to him and squint at the sapling and say, "What's wrong with your tree? I don't see any fruit on your tree." But they'll do that to you. They'll do that to a parent. You see, fruit takes time to grow. Your children, the fruit will be borne out over time. And I think it comes back to the insecurity of the parent, right? To say, oh my goodness, I actually don't know if this is going to work or not because I haven't been doing it long enough. I don't have time to see any fruit on my trees. And so I always tell parents 2 things that are very important. 1, fruit takes time to grow. And so don't put your children on display for other people. Let your children grow and learn in the safety of your home, where they know you're not gonna parade them out in front of people during Thanksgiving and feel like you need to have your children recite the states and their capitals, right? Because I promise you that over time, when that fruit begins to grow, the critics will be quieter. Jay and I have been homeschooling now for a very, very long time. And guess what? Not a single person in our family is criticizing what we're doing anymore. Why? Because there's fruit. So the first thing is to know that fruit takes time to grow. And the second thing is that you need to take confidence in what you know that you are capable of doing as a parent. And so you don't need to answer your critic. You don't need to answer your critic. You can be confident and say, I know this seems like a kind of off-the-wall solution, but we know it's going to work and we're excited. And then walk, because when your kids see that you're confident in that, guess what they're going to be? They're going to be confident also. And so your kids are taking their cues from you. So I always like to tell parents, listen, you're never going to be able to silence the critics, but you don't need to silence them. You only need to silence the voices in your own heart until such a time as your kids begin to show fruit, and they will, so be confident in it.
Talk about the benefits of homeschooling. Why homeschool? And I want this one to actually be not going in the direction of why would you put your kids in public school? Mm-hmm. And I know you've touched on this a bunch of times in different answers, but I want just a kind of a clearly thought out answer of why homeschool? What are the actual benefits of homeschooling our kids?
I think the first and the most important benefit of homeschooling is that it puts the parent in the driver's seat of their child's life. The Bible teaches us in Luke 6:40 that when a student is fully trained, he will be like his teacher. And as we look around the culture right now, I think it begs the question, who is teaching our children? Who is teaching our children, and what are they teaching our children? And parents are naturally concerned when our children are given to us, whether it's through adoption or they're handed to us in a delivery room like my children were. The very first thing, my very first instinct is to protect that child, right? It is our natural instinct as parents. And yet we set that instinct aside when we send our children to school. And to me, the primary benefit of having my children home with me is I am able to impart my worldview to my children to help them navigate what's happening around them from a biblical point of view. I want my children to see what is happening in the culture through the lens of what God says it should look like. So we take everything that's happening and we hold it up to the light of Scripture, and we sift everything through, and whatever comes out on the other side of that, that is the worldview that God would have us have. And so to me, it's about relationship first. It's about imparting worldview to our children and about equipping them so that they are ready to engage the culture. And we want our children to be ready. And what's amazing to me is as I've done that, and then we incorporate academics into it, right? We begin learning science and math and history and reading and language. And as we do that, it begins to weave a wonderful tapestry that makes our family stronger because we've learned these things together through the grid of Scripture. And when our children graduate, then we have confidence that we have taken every opportunity that God has given us to shape the hearts and minds of our children so that they can go into adulthood and serve the Lord.
One of the other arguments a lot of people use for choosing not to homeschool is because they think that our children need to go into the public school system or even the private school system and be salt and light. What do you say to that?
First of all, there's a battle that's being waged, right? We read about this in Ephesians 6. The Bible teaches us that the battle that we're waging is not against people. It's a spiritual battle. And we know that we are called to put on the armor of God. So we are teaching our children to be salt and light in the world, but we're not putting our children out onto the front lines of the battle until they're ready. So the front lines really in the culture right now, what is up for grabs in the culture? It's truth. Truth is what's in the crosshairs right now. And until our children are steeped in truth, until they know truth, until they can defend truth, we would never put a defenseless child out on the front lines. And education is a frontline battle. It is not a sideline battle. It's not something that's happening in the periphery of our lives. This is happening in the culture in real time. This is the front line of the culture. This is where the battle for truth is being fought, and it is where the battle for truth is being lost. And so we do not want our children out on the front lines. We are training our children to go out onto the front lines. And so to me, when we talk about salt and light, I say, let's put the people out on the front lines who are trained and ready for battle. I thank God for the many men and women who are Christians who know truth and can defend it, to be in the public school system, to be teachers, to be administrators, to be out on the playground helping these kids and talking to them. But our children are not equipped for battle when they are 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 years old. Many times they don't even understand the war. So would you put a defenseless child out onto the front lines of a battle that they do not understand and cannot comprehend? No, we would never do that. I think it's fascinating. A mom said to me one time, "Aren't you worried about sheltering your children?" And I said to her, we care more about sheltering tomato plants in the culture right now than we do about our precious children. And so if someone wants to accuse me of sheltering my children, my answer is always absolutely yes. I will shelter my child until I know my child can stand up against the elements of the culture. That is our job as parents. One of our primary jobs as parents is to shelter our children so that they can grow to maturity, and we slowly begin to remove the shelter from around them as we see that they are mature and that they understand the battle lines around them and can engage the culture from a position of strength rather than weakness.
You talk about the culture war. How is that playing out in public schools today?
Well, I think that any of us who are watching what's happening in the culture right now can see that there has been a massive shift in the culture. And a huge part of that shift is happening in education, right? And so years ago, I was in Chattanooga. My husband and I were staying there for my speaking season. And we were listening to the radio one night, and we heard that President Obama made a rule about bathrooms. We called it the bathroom bill, right? And this was front page news. It was all over the country that students could choose which bathroom they would like to go to. So if I feel like I'm a boy today, then I can use the boys' restroom. Well, immediately, as you can imagine, the phones of our nonprofit started ringing off the hook. Parents are terrified by this idea. They don't like it. 10 years ago, I would have never said that homeschooling is the best option. Absolutely, this is what parents should do. And I have changed my position, because at what point do you say the barn is on fire? At what point do we say enough is enough is enough? And so my husband and I began to think about our own neighborhood. We live just outside of Portland, Oregon, where the culture wars are raging. And we know, because we have friends who teach in the public schools, that our children are at risk now because adults are making decisions that are not only unwise for children, they are dangerous. And so we began to think, what is it that we can do to wake parents up to what's happening in the culture? We learned about something recently called comprehensive sex education. Every parent should understand what is behind comprehensive sex ed. People tell me, well, it's not in my state. It absolutely is in your state. And they're not teaching our children biology. They're teaching our children social engineering. They are teaching fiction as if it were fact. They are teaching our children that their gender is malleable and that they could possibly be born in the wrong body. We are teaching children this as young as 5 years old. And so to me, we have reached a point now where we are having not just a bad day in the public school, not just a bad stretch. We have reached a crisis of epidemic proportions whereby our schools can no longer be trusted to protect and educate our children. And so to me, I would say to parents now, why would we leave our children in an institution that is teaching them the antithesis of what we know to be true? Most parents that I talk to know that there are two genders, and yet we are sending our children to institutions that are literally lying to them in the name of social progressivism, and it is doing irreparable harm to our children. And so my feeling now and my strong belief has changed from saying, hey, look at homeschooling as a viable option to say public school is no longer a viable option. There has to be a better way for us to educate our children, to let them enjoy being children. Our children are literally having their childhood stolen from them. I was walking through the grocery store with my daughter. She's now 8 years old, but when she was 4 years old, I was walking with her through the grocery store checkout, and it's always the gauntlet, right? We go through the gauntlet and we try to say, hey, please don't pick up 15 Snicker bars and put them on the conveyor belt. But I looked over at my daughter, and she was very intently gazing at a cover of a magazine with a transgender man. And maybe you would remember seeing this picture of a man dressed in a corset. And she's tugging on my shirt. And I looked down at her, and she said, Mama, Mama. And I looked, and I mean, my heart was breaking for what she was saying, because I know the truth of that image. And she said, Mama, why is this man dressed like a princess? And in that moment, I had a decision to make. I could have glossed over it and turned the magazine around and pretended like she didn't ask the question, or I could have engaged with her. And I chose to engage with her at that moment because she was asking the question. Parents need to understand that we think our children don't see what's going on. They do. They're just being indoctrinated against something. They're being indoctrinated into a belief system that is wrong. And so I got down on my knees. I looked at Sailor right in her eyes, and I said, sweetheart, did God make you a boy or a girl? And she said, well, he made me a girl. And I said, you know, some people are confused, and they don't know if they are a boy or a girl. Some people don't know how loved they are, that God loves them just the way he made them, just the way that they were born. And you know what her next question was to me? She said, why doesn't someone tell him that? And I thought, oh my goodness, she's right. Why are we lying to our children? Why are we telling children, teaching children fiction as if it were fact in the name of a social agenda that we know is the antithesis of what is in reality? And so now I say to parents, listen, if you want to protect your children and you want to protect their hearts and their minds, you cannot leave them in a system of education that would teach them fiction as if it were fact, that would rob them of basic morality in the name of social justice. It's time to take your children out of public school. So a few years ago, I was introduced to the idea of comprehensive sex education. And at first I was like, that's fine. I mean, we want that for our kids, right? We want a comprehensive sex education for our children. Until I got a phone call from a lawmaker. And she said, Heidi, can I bring a sample of the Washington State Comprehensive Sex Education over to the Homeschool Resource Center so that you can look at it? I said, sure, bring it over. I was horrified at what I was reading. Abortion was mentioned as a normal healthcare practice to little girls starting in 5th grade 125 times. Our children are being taught that if they have feelings that are contrary to the body that they are born in other words, if your 3rd grade son is subjected to the idea of transgenderism, which they are doing all over the place. Just look at drag queen story hours, because the libraries have teamed up with the American Library Association that is pushing this dangerous ideology to children. And we are watching the schools literally come in and take over the sexual education of children, and parents do not even know that it's happening. Every single day we read headlines of children who are being taken from their parents because a school counselor hears that a child maybe thinks for a moment that he was born in the wrong body. And so what happens? We start telling these children, well, maybe you are in the wrong body. I have heard from parents whose children have been put on puberty blocking drugs, of little girls as young as 11 years old who are being prescripted breast binders to keep their breasts from developing. This is happening in our public schools. It is an assault against parental authority. It is an affront against our children, and it is doing irreparable damage to children. Parents need to understand that when they take their children to a public school and they drop that child off so that the child can learn about U.S. history and can learn about math and can learn about reading and learn about spelling, that is the least of what those children are actually learning about. And they also need to understand that when they drop their child off, they are giving their authority as parents to that school. And the school system then becomes the authority. The other thing I think that is increasingly alarming is that the schools are pitting children against their parents. So the child does not need to go to the parent for permission. The child goes to the teacher.